Hi everyone, my name is Tatum Rhodes, and today I'm going to be talking to you about social media's effects on news consumption. Firstly, we're going to start with my research question. My research question states, how does reliance on social media for news and information affect news consumers' perspective on the world? Now we will move on to my thesis. By news consumers relying on social media for news information, it greatly affects their perspective on the world by feeding them different biases and misinformation. While most of the communication theories provided in the Encyclopedia of Communication Theory could pertain to my research question, there is one that sticks out the most. The communication theory that best applies falls under the theories of influence and persuasion, or is better known as the social cognitive theory. The reason I selected this theory is because it focuses mainly on why people tend to model what they see in the media. And, just as my research question states, how does reliance on social media for news and information affect a news consumer's perspective on the world? According to Ann Oldorf Hirsch, the heavy reliance on social media as a source of news platforms may lead to a more passive audience when it comes to news consumption. A passive audience results in a more impressionable audience, which correlates with affecting the news audience's perspective on the world. It is also important to note that it's determined more than half of social media users get their news from social media platforms. Social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter are two of the most popular social media platforms for news consumption by users, even though this is not the main intent and purpose of these social media platforms. A study conducted by Oldorf Hirsch investigated the role of engagement with news content on Facebook and Twitter between news exposure and current events knowledge. The findings of this investigation support my research question because the results displayed that the key role of social media in news content is not particularly for knowledge gain, but rather the ability to engage users who may be passively receiving news on these sites. By engaging users, it is affecting their perspectives on the world, and as we have already established, a passive audience yields a more impressionable one. Other researchers, Johnson and Kay, investigated the comparison of the credibility of political news that is found on social media platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and blogs versus the alternative, considered traditional media. Traditional media could be considered as things such as television programs, newspaper, radio, magazines, and much more. Johnson and Kay then explored to see if credibility has a correlation to the motives behind using different social media platforms for news information. For example, does the popularity and credibility of Facebook make news consumers more inclined to use that platform rather than a newspaper? Their investigation consisted of a survey of 1,267 participants who were evaluated on their dependence and motivations behind using Facebook and Twitter for their source of political news. After the investigation was conducted, the results determined that political news consumers deemed traditional news sources, newspapers, radio stations, television programs, more credible than social media platforms. Many participants felt they were only given half-truths and fed biased information, which in turn skewed their perception on news stories. Something extremely interesting about the research findings that should be noted on this slide is that though the participants deemed traditional news more credible than social media platforms, they still only considered it moderately credible. Another study conducted by Lee, Lindsay, and Kim investigated the effect of news access via social media and news information overload on the perceptions of journalistic norms and practices. The study found that people preferred social media as a news source over traditional news sources because of the accessibility and speed of accessing information. Due to the fact that journalists can post directly on social media, it also allows for them to be able to interact with their audience. This can affect the reliability and credibility of the news they share because oftentimes the journalists will include their own personal biases. The study found that with access to news at the touch of a fingertip via social media and different social media platforms all sharing similar stories, it resulted in news information overload. News information overload is when individuals obtain an excessive amount of news, almost like a burnout. The statistics showed that due to the news information overload, social media users would avoid the news or only have selective exposure to it. Selective exposure to news can result in news consumers having a very blinded or biased perspective on the world due to the fact of only receiving some news and not all. It's safe to say that social media isn't going away anytime soon and has a complete chokehold on society. As a result, we will continue to encounter biases and misinformation on such platforms. Social media users who are also news consumers on social media platforms solely rely on social media platforms for their news. Their reliance turns into participation when they choose to share, like, and comment on news articles onto their own page. Eventually, news articles become less factual and more centered around the interaction of news consumers. This can result in biased and unreliable news, which consequently distorts consumers' perspectives and views on the world around them. Thanks for tuning in to my final presentation, and I hope you liked it.